that we start our second webinar from the series of the training, best management practices of the Forest Service of the US on the quality of water in Ukraine. We had this arrangement, this agreement that we only have introduction speeches at the first webinar. The second one will be practice-oriented immediately from the very beginning, and that's how it's going to happen. No introductory speeches. Today, let me just remind you.
Не розумію, чому мій не переключається моя
Just a second. I cannot start my presentation for some reason. We see the first slide of it.
Можливо, в мене теж не
Переключилося, біжить дуже швидко.
Бачу.
Now it goes.
Можливо, це якісь питання зв'язку також.
Must be some connection-related issues. Anyway, our training takes part in the framework of best management practices of the Forest Service of the US for Quality of Water in Ukraine project. It is funded with the support of the Forest Service of the US, and we are grateful to the American people and taxpayers for supporting our projects and helping us. Organizers of the trainings are NGO Forza and Forest Service of the US, and our experts and thus lecturers are the experts or partners of the Forest Service of the US. And we have 6 topics for our webinars. We will have 6 webinars. Last week, we covered the best management practices to protect vulnerable water resources. It was presented by Pauline Adams. And today, on the 25th, we are going to have this webinar on the best practices for the storages, the logging facilities, and this will be covered by Mr. Tom Pavlesic, and we will introduce him in a minute. Next topic, it is the logging technology, and the expert is Lisa Wall. Number 4, it is compliance with requirements and monitoring of breakthroughs in the water capture basin of around the city of New York. Chris Brown, then projecting and designing roads low loads. This is Erika Boron. She visited Ukraine. She held a training in Ukraine, and many of you, if you personally attended that training, you know her. And the last webinar will be on dissemination of data and information websites with public access reporting, tracking services from John Carlson. It is going to happen on the 23rd, and there we are going to wrap up the training. Let me just note, and I'm very happy to note that there are a lot of people here, many people who joined last time have joined us as well. A representative of State Forest Agency, Mr. Igor Bocinski, is with us. We are grateful too. Our colleagues, American colleagues who participate in this webinar, that's, as mentioned, Mr. Tom Pavlesic, our expert and lecturer today.
Також з нами сьогодні координатор.
Also, we have here coordinator from the International Programs of the Forest Service Department, Ms. Chilet Seger. And let me check if anyone else has joined. I see Mr. Carlgan Conan, Mr. Chris Brown, Lisa Bow. So a good team of American experts with us today. So that's a great opportunity because other experts, colleagues could add up to and provide additional information. And maybe I will stop here. And now I'm ready to pass the floor to Tom Pavlesic, and we'll look forward to his very interesting presentation. I had a chance to see it a bit earlier. And now, again, I have some technical issues. Sorry. Speaking about the housekeeping rules for the webinars, I ask you to actively participate, to ask questions, to clarify what's not clear. We agreed with the experts of the Forest Service that they are ready to take questions as we go. If there are any clarification questions, you can do that. If you have questions on the way, you can raise hand and ask it. And if the questions you have accumulated some, if you accumulate some questions after the presentation, we do plan a Q&A part. For some reason, I cannot switch to the next presentation.
Якщо можливо, тримайте включені камери.
So if it is possible, please have your cameras video on. Of course, if you have poor communication, you are not required to do that. You can unmute yourselves when you want to say something, but please try to stay muted and to avoid background noise. Unfortunately, I cannot show that slide to you, but that's okay. And now Lesia asked us to activate your video so that we could take a screenshot to have this photo for further reference.
I'm sorry, I don't have a translation on my end.
Чи всі розібралися з
Tom,
перекладом?
please choose the English channel under the globe on the lower part of the screen. You will see a globe between the reactions and sharing the screen. Please choose the English channel and stay on it. І для наших українських учасників, будь
And for Ukrainian participants,
Okay,
you
I
can
have
follow
it now.
the globe button. And dear colleagues, please choose your Ukrainian language channel if you need interpretation. This is reactions in the bottom part, near reactions in the bottom part of your screen. So stay there. You will hear Ukrainian speakers in Ukrainian and our English-speaking colleagues in the interpretation. If you understand both languages, you can stick to the floor. So, question to Ukrainian colleagues. Can you hear the interpretation well? Can you confirm that? Okay. Now let's take the photo.
Всі ще включаються. Ну, давайте, включайте ще раз, перефоткайте.
People are still joining. Let's take make another try.
Щиро дякую.
Thank you so much. And I pass over to Natalia. Okay, done. If you have any problems about interpretation or anything, please write in the chat box so that we could quickly respond and see what's going on. And again, if you have questions, you have this reactions option in the bottom of your screen, and you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question or express some other emotions, maybe to applaud or to show how cool the information is. You can also use those reactions. Now, I'm ready to pass the floor to Mr. Tom Pavlesic, and you're welcome.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to everybody today. It's a great pleasure, and I hope I am able to give you some information that you find is interesting. And if at any point you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to address them during my presentation. Otherwise, we can wrap it up afterwards in our discussion. So with that, I will share my screen and begin. Okay, so my name is Tom Pavlesic, and I'm the Forestry Program Manager at the Watershed Agricultural Council. I'm here to talk about how we use forestry water quality best management practices in the New York City watershed. So WAC, which is my organization, is a non-government, not-for-profit organization created by citizens, farmers, loggers, sawmill owners, and landowners from the New York City watershed in 1995. The Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, which is a US federal law, requires that all public water supplies be free of contaminants and safe to drink. In 1990, New York City proposed laws and regulations in the watershed that severely restricted farming and forestry in order to protect their drinking water. These proposed restrictions would make farming and forestry impossible and damage the economies of the small, rural watershed communities. In 1993, the watershed towns and villages fought New York City in court, forcing them to support the economic viability of the New York City watershed communities and protect their drinking water use through voluntary farm and forestry best management practices. So WAC works with farmers, loggers, foresters, and forest landowners to encourage them to voluntarily protect New York City's drinking water from contaminants. Now, this is a map of the New York City watershed. You can see where we are located in the United States on the map in the lower left. We are right here. Now, in the upper right, you can see the two portions of the New York City watershed. The one closest to the city, which New York City is down in the lower right-hand corner, is the Croton watershed. It is on the east side of the Hudson River. It is 1,300 square kilometers, and it is the oldest portion of the New York City watershed, dating back to the mid to late 1800s. The Catskill Delaware watershed, which is the larger portion on the west side of the Hudson River, dates back to the late 1800s and up to the 1950s, and it is 3,800 square kilometers. Drinking water is transported by gravity from 19 reservoirs over 200 kilometers to New York City. So the New York City watershed is the largest unfiltered municipal water supply in the United States. It is 485,000 hectares total. It supplies 34 billion liters of drinking water each day to more than 9 million New York City residents. Now I want to give you a feel for the landscape that we're working in. The Catskill Delaware watershed is 79% forested. New York City owns 8% of this forest land. New York State owns 24% of this forest land. And private citizens like you and me own 68% of this forest land. So more than 35,000 people like us own the forests that filter New York City's drinking water. Now, our landscape is heavily forested. It's made up of a majority of hardwood trees with a small amount of softwood. Our hardwood trees are maple, ash, beech, birch, cherry, and oak. Our softwood trees are white pine, red pine, Norway spruce, and hemlock. There are approximately 200 harvests each year covering 2,800 hectares in the New York City watershed. 93% of these harvests are classified as light cuts, meaning that less than 50% of the forest canopy is removed. The average harvest size is 15 hectares, and less than 5% of the harvested hectares are within 30 meters of a stream. When it comes to cutting trees down, the most common method is hand cutting with a chainsaw. Mechanized harvesters are less common and limited by our steep terrain. A mechanized harvester can weigh as much as 16,000 kilograms. Cable skidders are the most common method of removing trees from the forest. They are large forest tractors that pick up and drag logs by attaching them to a cable, and they weigh 9,000 kilograms. Grapple skidders are also a common method of removing trees from the forest here. They use a large claw to pick up the trees and drag them out of the forest. They weigh approximately 10,000 kilograms. Small bulldozers are also common. They are used to remove trees from steep ground. They are also used to install best management practices, and they can weigh 10,000 kilograms. Forwarders are uncommon because of the cost to purchase and maintain them, as well as the limitations on steep ground. They can weigh 18,000 kilograms. Landing loaders are very common for sorting and loading logs on landings. Triaxle log trucks are most common for transporting logs to sawmills, and they can weigh 27,000 kilograms fully loaded. Semi-trailer log trucks are also common for transporting logs to sawmills, and they can weigh 36,000 kilograms fully loaded. Now, there's a reason I've been telling you how much all of this logging equipment weighs. Heavy logging equipment compresses and compacts the soil, creating runoff and the potential for erosion. Logging trails then gather this runoff, much like they're used to gather trees, and they concentrate it into larger volumes and channel it down steeper slopes, giving it the power to erode soils. Water quality best management practices return this runoff to its natural place in the landscape before it collects in larger volumes, gets channeled down steep slopes, and creates erosion. Our job in the New York City watershed is to provide the technical assistance and financial incentives to encourage the voluntary use of best management practices by loggers, landowners, and foresters. We encourage loggers to use proper trail layout that minimizes steep slopes, wet soils, erosion, and sedimentation. And we provide them with a financial incentive to compensate them for their time, fuel, equipment use, and the opportunity cost for using their time to implement this BMP rather than pursuing more profitable activities. As explained by our previous presenter, water bars are simple mounds of soil excavated into the road to divert water at periodic intervals. It's important to note that water bars only work in teams, so you usually need many of them. Each water bar removes a small amount of runoff from the surface of the road. The chart on this page explains the proper distance between water bars. The steeper the road is, the more water bars are needed to handle the increasing force of the runoff. And again, we provide loggers with a financial incentive to compensate them for their time, fuel, equipment use, and the opportunity cost for using their time to implement this BMP, rather than pursuing more profitable activities. An open top culvert is another method for removing runoff from the surface of a road. The idea is the same as the water bar, to remove small volumes of water from the road before it collects in large volumes and gains enough velocity to create erosion. Open top culverts are tough enough to continue to function even with heavy log trucks and skidders driving over them. And again, we provide loggers with a financial incentive to compensate them for their time, fuel, equipment use when implementing this BMP. Now, I'm repeating this because this is the most important lesson we've learned over 25 years. BMPs are not implemented for free. Someone always pays to do it, and it's almost always the logger that absorbs that cost. We need to respect this fact if we want to succeed and encourage the voluntary implementation of BMPs in the New York City watershed. We need to respect loggers and their businesses and their need to make profit to remain in business. Diversion ditches intercept subsurface water flow on the uphill side of the road and divert the water to a place where it cannot re-enter the road. And this is another BMP where we provide financial incentives to offset the costs that a logger confronts when he implements this BMP. And if we cannot find a place on one side of a road to direct water using a diversion ditch, we may be forced to transport the water under the road in a culvert to a place where it can no longer impact the road. And this is our financial incentive for a culvert, which covers the cost of either a steel culvert or a plastic pipe, as well as some of the machine time that the logger spends to install this BMP. We also pay loggers to regrade skid trails. This technique uses a bulldozer to remove the wheel ruts from road surface. Wheel ruts can concentrate runoff, allowing an otherwise small and harmless amount of water to gather in sufficient volume to cause erosion. So the BMPs I just finished talking about focus mainly on managing water on the surface of a road. Stream buffers are BMPs that remove sediment from the runoff that we have collected with our water bars before it enters a stream. Our stream buffers have variable widths that are wider when the land beside them is steeper. This provides more space for the runoff to disperse its erosive energy and sediment before it can enter a stream. Another way we remove sediment from runoff before it enters a stream is with bales of straw. Now, we give these straw bales to loggers for free, and it's common for us to use these in and around stream buffers where the likelihood of sedimentation is very high. Stilt fence is a woven synthetic fabric that is porous enough for water to pass through while sediment is trapped. We also give this BMP to loggers for free, and it is deployed in a similar manner to straw bales. We also pay loggers to use geotextile fabric on log landings and wet sections of road to prevent fine sediments from mixing with the gravel road surface. So fabric is similar to silt fence, and we prevent this mixing of gravel and sediments so we can reduce the amount of fine materials in the runoff and reduce the overall likelihood of runoff sediment reaching water bodies. Now, one of our most effective BMPs is the 7-meter portable skidder bridge. These bridges are composed of 3 separate panels, as you can see below in this picture. We use strong, durable, and rot-resistant wood. White oak is our preference. This wood withstands the strain of heavy equipment passing over it and lasts a long time. We purchase the raw lumber from local sawmills and often construct the bridges with our loggers during our logger training workshops. But loggers can also receive a financial incentive payment from us to build their own bridge for use in the New York City watershed. The bridges that we construct are added to a fleet of bridges that are available for loan to loggers free of charge. We have 15 7-meter bridges, 3 10-meter bridges, 1 12-meter bridge, and 1 15-meter bridge available for loggers to use in the New York City watershed. This picture is a picture of 3 of our 7-meter bridges being used to cross a stream in the New York City watershed. And loggers also receive a financial incentive payment to transport the bridges and install them in accordance with BMP recommendations. And we don't just give a logger a bridge. We also require that they work with us to develop a plan for implementing BMPs during the installation, use, and removal of the bridge. And because water quality is our priority, we provide additional financial incentives for the successful implementation of this plan. So to summarize everything, 25% of harvests each year receive technical support and financial assistance from WAC to implement best management practices in the New York City watershed. But these harvests represent 40% of the acreage that is harvested each year in the New York City watershed. And on average, loggers receive approximately $5,800 to implement voluntary BMPs on a harvest in the New York City watershed in 2022. So hopefully people have questions at this point, which I'm happy to answer.
Дякуємо Тому за
Thank
чудову.
you, Tom, for this very interesting presentation.
Будь ласка, дивлюся.
And now I'm
У нас є
tracking
перше питання.
the questions. I see the first question from Yuri.
Тоді розпочинаємо сесію
Let's start our Q&A session then. So the question is, so the transportable movable bridges, are they provided for the loggers on which conditions? Can they rent them or how does it happen?
Sure. So the bridges are, we have 3 storage locations spread throughout the watershed. Loggers notify us when they would like to borrow a bridge. And if one is available, they pick them up and transport them to the harvest site. They don't need to pay us for the bridge. They use it for free. We then keep track of where all of our bridges are and the amount of time they're scheduled to be used. When the logger is finished, they return the bridge to a storage facility and another logger is free to pick it up if it's available.
Дякуємо за запитання і за відповідь.
Thank you for your question.
Наступне
Thank you
запитання
for
в нас
your
пана
And the
Громяка.
next question
Юрія.
from Mr. Gromyak.
Вітаю. Фінансова підтримка за
Hello.
рахунок бюджету
So
міста
is the
Нью-Йорк.
financial support paid from the budget of the city of New York City?
That is correct. So the financial incentives that we pay come from the rates that citizens of New York City pay for their water. So if you live in New York City, you're paying for every gallon of water that you use in your home or business, residence, or facility. That money goes into a large budget, managed by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. That budget is used to maintain the watershed infrastructure, and we are part of that infrastructure. So they provide us with money to then give to loggers to pay for these best management practices. This money is also used to build and maintain aqueducts, maintain dams, and all the infrastructure that manages the New York City drinking water supply. There is also a small filtration plant for the Croton portion of the New York City watershed that this money is used to pay for. They filter the water and treat it with UV light prior to sending it down to New York City.
Дякуємо за відповідь. Володимир Леонідович, це у вас оплески були, я так зрозуміла.
Thank you for this answer. As far as I understood, this was a round of applause. No? This is your raised hand. Okay. If you have a question, if you'd like to clarify. Yeah, I'd like to clarify on this question. I basically have two questions, but I'd like to clarify what Yuri asked. What is the scope of funding? For example, for the establishment of open waters for geotextile materials, are there some limitations? I understand it depends on a specific plot, but still.
Yes, we have rules that govern the use of funding on each harvest. There is a maximum amount of funding that can be used by a logger on a single harvest. So any BMPs that are implemented beyond that maximum are paid for by the logger. But we find that our financial incentives are sufficient to have all of the work done that is required to be done on the site. But yeah, there is a maximum that is allowable per harvest. And we have set rates for each BMP that we will pay. And we only pay that incentive money when we inspect and see a completed best management practice.
Для прикладу, там, на кубічний
But
метр.
for an example, per cubic meter of harvested timber or per hectare of a forested plot, like general ballpark figure, are you trying to get the maximum amount? Not necessarily maximum, a medium amount, sort of in the middle, if possible.
Oh, so what we want to see are best management practices implemented in accordance with the specifications. The specifications that we use are very similar to the document that was shared by the previous speaker, the translated best management document from New Hampshire. So when we are working on a harvest, that dictates the number of best management practices that should be used to protect water quality on that site. I think I answered your question.
Tom, I think the question of Volodymyr was, can you provide amount of an example of the average funds spent per harvest?
For 1 cubic meter or for 1 hectare of forest area?
Sure. So we don't calculate that by hectare, but we do provide on average in 2022, $5,800 of incentives per harvest on average. There are larger harvests that can receive up to $11,000 of incentives for the harvest, and there are much smaller harvests that can receive less. But it doesn't break down to a per hectare number very well because the amount of roads on a harvest aren't necessarily directly related to the acreage or the hectares being harvested. You can have smaller hectare harvests that have many stream crossings and many roads that require more funding.
Дякуємо. Володимир Леонідович, чи
Thank
відповіли?
you, Volodymyr. Have you received your answer? And another question so that I didn't go back to this. Are there officially adopted normative documents for the open pipes?
Yes, we have documents similar to what you've been provided in New York that lays out the specifications for best management practices. The open pipes, however, we have documents that stipulate the spacing between the open top structures, but we are very open to what that specific structure looks like. It can be a steel pipe with slots cut in it. It could also be two small diameter trees that are placed in the surface of the road to catch the water. It could also be pieces of pressure treated lumber with that form an open top culvert to transport the water. We really look for the effectiveness of the structure in controlling surface water, rather than very strict specifications on how those structures are built. And since we only pay after an inspection, it gives us the ability to alter the structures to make us happy with how they function.
Ну, можливо, мене не зрозуміли. Я хотів спитати.
I may have been slightly misunderstood. I wanted to ask this. Is it regulated by the state normative documents? Are there any strict official documents?
Документами
Or is
типу
it regulated by documents like recommendations on best practices or best management practices? Is it enough to just use these materials by using best management practices, or are there any other state regulatory documents on that?
So this is a very interesting question. In New York, and each state in the US has different laws that govern forestry activities. New York does not have many laws that govern forestry practices. The only law that New York State has is for crossing streams. They require that a permit is applied for and issued prior to crossing a stream. The reason New York doesn't have laws that govern forestry is because this is a very marginal industry where profit is very difficult, and additional regulations can reduce businesses and limit businesses and actually harm our rural economies. Forestry is viewed in a very similar manner in New York as farming is. They are given more flexibility in the impacts they have on the environment. And that's also similar across the United States at the federal level. Our Clean Water Act, which is a federal law that governs the impact activities have on our nation's waters, forestry has an exemption to those laws because it is such a economically marginal business. But in order for that exemption to exist to the federal law, every state has to have a series of voluntary best management practices that have been developed and distributed to loggers. And then we have to encourage loggers to do these activities voluntarily, to implement these best management practices voluntarily. So there isn't a very structured legal regulatory system for best management practices in New York and the United States, there is a voluntary approach. We want people to do this without legal pressure because we don't want that legal pressure to put them out of business. I hope that's clear.
Так. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Дякуємо. Леся, якщо це уточнюючі запитання, будь ласка.
Let's say if this is a clarification. Yes, regarding best practices. Tom, can you tell me more? You mentioned that you do not want to make additional legislative pressure, but for example, I am an organization that decides to apply best practice, and it is described, and you gave an example of New Hampshire. How closely do I need to follow these recommendations of best practices? That's one half of my question. A second half of my question, is anybody then checking it? You said you are motivating and giving, bonuses for that. Okay. Yeah, we also have a few questions on chat to clarify that.
Okay, so very good questions. So let me, there's a few things in there to answer. The first question is, how strictly are we adhering to these voluntary guidelines, these voluntary BMP rules that have been developed? And the answer to that is, the performance is a spectrum. Loggers that we work with, some of them aren't familiar with best management practices, and we are training them to do this work. So their initial attempts to adhere to the guidelines, the BMP specifications, are weak. But we continue to work with them over time, giving them feedback and encouraging them to improve their performance until they start to do a better job and meet and exceed the BMP specifications. And I think it's important for us to have this approach because we're looking to change their behavior over the long term. We're taking somebody who didn't implement best management practices and turning them into somebody who is implementing them effectively. So it's very common for us to see a range of performance from individual loggers. But our goal is to encourage everybody to be implementing these things at a high level of quality. Now, not all loggers work well with us. These are voluntary best management practices. Some loggers don't want to pay or take their time to protect New York City's water supply. And in some cases, we have to stop working with some loggers because they're just not giving us the quality of work we're looking for. It's uncommon for that to happen, but it has happened. There are also loggers in the New York City watershed that don't want to participate with us. They are not interested in working with government entities, what they think are regulatory entities, and they just refuse to work with us. And that's just part of the work that we do. We can't convince everybody to do these things. Now, as far as how do we monitor the quality of the work, we inspect all work after it is done, and we only pay for what meets specifications. Beyond that, we also work with forestry universities in New York State to conduct research that evaluates the effectiveness of these best management practices on the ground. We look at the effectiveness of individual best management practices for protecting water quality. And we also look at whether loggers within the watershed are implementing these practices at higher rates than loggers outside of the New York City watershed, so that we can monitor whether or not our incentives are incentivizing the implementation of BMPs. And the research that we have conducted points to the effectiveness of our programs. And this research has been published in peer-reviewed American journals, scientific journals, like the Journal of Forestry, the Journal of Forest Engineering. So that's how we keep an eye on the effectiveness of our programs to make sure that we're getting the outcomes that we want.
Дякуємо, Том.
Thank you, Tom. There was a question on chat that was waiting for its time, and you've partially answered that. How is control exercised of the loggers? How do you control the loggers? That, yeah, their activity gets reviewed and only best management practices applied and exercised are being paid for. There is another adjacent question on that. There's Irina Shpakivska who's asking, do you envisage any fines if the loggers make a mistake? You mentioned about financial incentives, but do you have fines as well on the sort of contrary, on the other end of spectrum, if there are any violations?
Yes, there are fines, although best management practices aren't legally required by law. It is still against the law to introduce sediment into a water body in New York State. And New York State can fine anybody, a private landowner, a logger, a farmer, a construction contractor, for introducing sediment into a water body. New York City can also issue separate fines. New York City is granted the power to create laws that apply within the New York City watershed boundaries. And this is very unique in the USA because cities usually can only pass laws that affect the citizens and land within the boundaries of their city. But in the case of the watershed, New York City is allowed to pass laws and enforce them within the watershed itself. And this is very, very unique because it runs contrary to a standard American practice, which is the right for citizens to elect and control government entities that impact our daily lives. And the citizens of the New York City watershed do not elect government officials in New York City. So this is a very unique circumstance, but New York City has the ability to pass fines for adding sediment to water bodies. And we have seen this happen. What usually occurs when a logger is adding sediment to a water body, New York City calls us and asks us to intervene and work with the logger to fix the problem before a fine is issued. If the logger refuses, the fine can be significantly high. If a logger works with us to fix the problem, the fine is often lowered or completely eliminated. But we try to avoid direct regulatory interventions in favor of encouraging loggers to voluntarily do these things with our assistance.
Дякую, Том, за відповідь.
Thank you, Tom, for this answer. On my turn, I would like to clarify. Is it some kind of third entity that is exercising this control and can define the fines Is it your organization or is there another controlling body that may visit any logging and check whether or not things are happening according to norms?
Okay, so New York State has police officers that have the
Штат
authority
Нью-Йорк має
they have the authority to enter private land and enforce these environmental laws and issue fines. New York City also has police officers stationed in the New York City watershed that are allowed to enter private land to enforce these laws and issue these fines.
Дякую. Тобто ваша організація взагалі цим не
Thank you.
займається?
So your organization is not involved in that part. Your organization is motivating and the police is controlling if necessary, correct?
And that's absolutely correct. And it's necessary for us because we need to be seen as a trusted partner in encouraging voluntary implementation. We can't make people work with us. They have to trust us. So if we see a problem on a logging job, we don't report it right away. We try to solve the problem first voluntarily before, bringing in officials to issue fines. And we've never had to do that. We've never had to report somebody and have them get fined for their behavior. So it's important for us to have a high level of trust with loggers because we only pay for best management practices after the work has been done. And the work that loggers do, the fuel that their equipment consumes, the wear and tear on their equipment, the time that they spend doing it, all costs a lot of money for a small business. So they are spending their own money to do this BMP work. And then weeks to months later, we then essentially give them the incentive. So there is a high degree of trust that has to exist because they have to be confident that my organization is going to send them a check to pay for the work that they've already done. So long-term funding is very important for programs like mine because it takes years to build trust in our logger community to encourage them to work with us.
Дякую, пане Том. Якраз
Thank you, Tom. Yuri was asking on exactly that, a very similar question. Based on the presentation, we can see that logging is using a lot of highly costly equipment and very modern equipment and machinery. How available is this equipment
для лісозаготівельників
for the loggers?
і на яких умовах вони її
And on what
можуть
conditions do
придбати?
they receive it?
В лізинг з
How can they
розсрочкою на
buy it? Is
10
it
років
do they lease it with, say, 10-year
і більше, на 10 і більше років,
installments or
з
more than 10 years?
з низьким відсотком за кредит?
Or with low interest rates on interest?
Як практично лісозаготівельники
And how
купують таку
do
техніку?
loggers buy this equipment on a practical level? What's the practical way of acquiring that equipment and machinery?
That's an absolutely great question because it speaks to the economic viability of a small logging business and how they can stay in business and make money. So loggers can receive beneficial interest rates on loans to purchase expensive equipment. These interest rates are often available for farms and forestry businesses because they are just fundamentally different from larger businesses in New York. Loggers often purchase the equipment and then make monthly payments on that equipment over time, 5 years or even 10 years. And let me see. We have the equipment is readily available. There is a very large used equipment market. Most of the loggers we work with purchase used equipment. And we find that loggers preferentially purchase very old equipment, even now, because it is simpler to maintain. It has less downtime. There's less unproductive time doing repairs. The repairs can be done in the woods by themselves. With modern equipment, modern harvesters, modern skidders, there's a lot of computers and chips in those pieces of equipment. And they can be very difficult to repair in the woods. So the modern equipment, although it has higher rates of productivity associated with it, which theoretically can increase your profitability, it also has higher maintenance costs and longer downtime because the loggers can't repair it as quickly. Often loggers purchase machines from the 1970s because it's just very simple equipment that can be repaired by themselves with a welder and simple tools in the woods. So it's not unusual for us to be working with loggers with very old machinery. It's also not unusual for loggers to have many different skidders, 4 or 5 different skidders that are old. And what they'll do is they will be cutting many jobs at once. And they'll have one skidder on each job. And when one skidder breaks down, they will go use another skidder on another job while they wait for a part. Or if the ground conditions and the weather conditions are poor on one site, if the conditions can cause sedimentation, they will move to a better site while the ground conditions improve. So that's also very common for us. But generally speaking, equipment ownership is incredibly expensive, and loggers can be paying $10,000 a month in equipment fees, equipment payments, just to stay in business. So it's a very expensive business to stay in. It has high costs. So logger productivity has to be very high to generate the revenue to keep themselves in business.
Дякую Тому за відповідь.
Thank you, Tom, for your answer. So far, I don't see questions in the chat, and I do have several questions for you. Tom, you mentioned that there are loggers who are reluctant to work with you. They believe that the state is like an enemy or a regulatory obstacle, but actually, in view of that, you compensate the costs, and you mentioned that the compensations are adequate. Considering all of that, why this financial incentive is not like an incentive for them? Why don't they want to collaborate even with those incentives?
Sure. So in America, it's not unusual for loggers and just citizens to be very distrustful of large government entities. It's part of how America was founded. It's just cultural beliefs. So there are just some people who are not comfortable working with government entities. And in the New York City watershed, some of this stems from the way New York City developed and built its watershed. When New York City expanded the watershed into the west of Hudson region, they often engaged in very cruel practices They took land from farmers without compensation or with very minimal compensation. Communities and towns were razed. They were destroyed in order to make room for reservoirs. Some of the people we work with, their families, cemeteries were dug up and their deceased relatives were moved and transported to other cemeteries so that the reservoirs could be built. So there is a lot of negative feelings towards New York City because of the unfair way they treated the people from the watershed. This is why when New York City initially didn't want to do voluntary best management practices. They were just going to prevent forestry and farming from occurring in the watershed because that's the best way to protect their water quality. So when they tried to do that, the farmers and the loggers and the local people got upset and took New York City to court and prevented them from doing that. The reason that the citizens were upset really stems back to all of these things that New York City did, from taking their land and digging up cemeteries, and really destroying communities in the watershed. All of those negative feelings really came from that. And we are starting to grow out of those generations that were directly impacted by those. But I still meet and talk with people who were alive and lived on land that is now at the bottom of a reservoir.
Дякую. Це пояснює.
Thank you. That very much explains this legacy conflict that prevents people from collaborating with the authorities that used to inflict so much damage on them. Thank you. And I have another very short question. You mentioned that you pay for the best practices that are implemented. May it happen that your partners, loggers, your counterparts come, implement best practices, but actually then you see that nothing actually has been done and the situation is irreversible. So if it may happen that you refuse to pay for the work that they allegedly kind of did.
That is correct. We have had a few instances where the work was so poor and limited that we refuse to give them anything. But those situations are very few. We typically, when we're not happy, talk to them, show them what would make us happy, and help them do the work that we want to see. There is a minimum amount of work that needs to be done in order to receive our funds. We won't pay for sloppy work. And we also expect loggers to improve their performance from one job to the next. If loggers continuously show us lower quality work, we communicate with them and talk to them about it. And if they persist in poor quality work, then we will stop working with them.
Розуміло. Дякую за відповідь.
And thank you for your answer. And I see another question from Yuri. Are there cases where representatives of local communities or environmental activists block or prevent logging for certain reasons? And if it happens, how often does civil society kind of uses that in the activists?
Yes. So it is very common for environmental groups or concerned citizens to use the court system to block forest management on public lands all across the United States. This is a very challenging situation for the U.S. Forest Service in the Western United States, where there is a lot of publicly owned, federally owned forest land. And New York City owned forest land in the watershed can also have the same thing happen, where private citizens can attempt to block harvesting. We work with the private forest lands, and there are robust protections for private ownership in the United States. It's much more difficult to prevent a private landowner from not harvesting their trees than it is to prevent a public entity like New York City or the United States federal government from harvesting trees. But it's actually common on publicly owned land to have the courts intervene in management.
Дякую за відповідь.
Thank you for your answer. And I don't see any more questions in the chat. Maybe participants are still thinking. And while we have this short pause, I'd like to ask Tom, though I now see Lesa's hand. Okay, let's go ahead with Lesia.
Чи нема?
Та щось так мишкою важко включається мікрофон. Том, я би хотіла запитати.
Well, Tom, I have this question. On one of your slides, you indicated that they do logging 50% of the available scope of timber, so of wood. So, okay, here we speak about quality assurance of water, best practices, but is there any threshold, any limit on logging that can be done in the framework of your territory, the territory under your responsibility, to make sure that the quality of water is okay without any residue or other problems?
Sure. So there are no laws that govern the removal of trees or limit the number of trees that you can remove from a hectare. You can, if I'm a private landowner, I can tomorrow cut all of the trees on 100 hectares, and there are no laws that would prevent me from doing that. And that's okay for water quality because the physical act of cutting the trees isn't harmful to water quality. It's the removal of the trees and the access systems that negatively impact water quality. So that's how that works. Private land, there's not a lot of regulation of private land in New York. And in the big picture, as long as the land isn't being converted to a non-forest use, New York City's water quality is going to remain high because forests are the reason the water quality is very high, and the entire reason New York City uses this area to supply its water. The biggest threats to New York City's water quality are the conversion of forest land to non-forest uses. So in this portion of New York State, we have a lot of affluent people in New York City that want to purchase vacation homes and retreats in the New York City watershed region. So the development of this forest land and the creation of impervious surfaces like driveways, septic systems, homes and houses and buildings, all of those things create runoff that negatively impact water quality. farming is also a large threat to water quality because of sedimentation as well as pathogens that can infect people. Pathogens like Cryptosporidia. So, you know, in the big picture, forests are the preferred land use in the New York City watershed. And working forests specifically are the preferred land use in the watershed, because a working forest that is managed provides revenue and money to the people who own it, and that money can be used to pay taxes and to help them continue to own their forest land as forest land. It's the conversion of this land to non-forest uses that provides the biggest threat. And the way that we tax privately owned land in the United States and in New York actually pushes land to be developed. It's a large threat to forest land, because if I own a piece of forest land, I have to pay taxes based on the highest and best use of that property. So if my property can be turned into and developed into a large industrial facility, my taxes are higher. And that can actually push ownership costs higher than I can afford, and forces me to sell the land and to somebody who will develop it. So the way we tax our forest land in New York is a very large threat to New York City's water quality, as well as for the forest itself.
Дякую Тому за відповідь.
Thank you for your answer. In connection with this question, I have another one. If there are any incentives in this case for owners of forests to support the persistent forest coverage, because you say that the greatest risk for the watershed of New York is changing the type of use of the lands, where it is no longer the forest, but agricultural or roads or whatever. So is there a difference in payment of taxes or in benefits that people may have, depending on the situation, if they have the persistent, the standing forest coverage, or if they sometimes cut their trees and then replant?
Yes, so there are legal programs that can reduce people's property taxes to make ownership less expensive. In New York, it's called the 480A Forest Tax Law. And people who own forest land can reduce their property taxes by up to 80% by agreeing to manage their woods and cut trees from their woods over a period of time. And my organization, we provide incentive money to landowners to enroll their property in that 480A tax law program. So we provide education to teach people that this is an opportunity for them to lower their taxes. And then we provide financial incentives to help them pay to meet the requirements of enrollment, to enroll that land. And beyond the 480A forest tax law, my organization also purchases forest easements and easement rights on property. That's where we actually purchase the right to develop a piece of land from a landowner. The landowner retains physical ownership of the property. They are then legally limited in what they can do with the property, because my organization owns the right to develop that property. We own the right to build new buildings and put in driveways and impervious surface and septic systems. We own that right. And we essentially just extinguish that right so it cannot be done anymore. And my organization owns 35,000 acres of forest easements and farm easements in the New York City watershed. So those are ways that we try to keep our forested landscape forested and keep our farming landscape farming.
Дякую гарно за відповідь. Шановні наші
Thank you for
колеги,
your answer. And now, colleagues,
я вас дуже заохочую запитати.
you are very much welcome to ask your questions. That's a very interesting practice when there is an organization that is an intermediary between the government and land owners, land users, and providers of services that increases their awareness about how they can use best management practices, that trains people on implementing these practices, looks for the best options from the point of view of economic benefits, revenues. And maybe while you're thinking about your questions, I could jump on the opportunity and ask Tom maybe to say a couple of more words about your organization, why and how you were created, number of staff, main areas. It would be very interesting for me, at least, because this is really the highest degree of democracy, where organizations, various forms of organizations, all of them are involved in the system of natural resource management. All of them have distinct roles, but they are full-fledged partners in the system. In contrast to the centralized system where there is the state owner, the state as an owner, and forest user. And this system is much less flexible. Here we can see how a system may be flexible and how different participants and organizations are involved. If I may, I would like to add to that. So often in our practice, we see situations where, say, there is a territory of a national park, a national reserve, and there are water sources, and the economic entities in the territory of the park or adjacent to that, they often use this water. According to the Ukrainian legislation, national parks cannot trade in water, sell their water. However, they do tend to use that. How do you govern that in the US?
Sure. So water law in the United States is very interesting, and it's actually different depending on what part of the United States you're in. The eastern portion of the United States is governed by a principle called riparian rights, where it sounds like it's very similar to Ukraine, where everybody is entitled to use water from surface water bodies as long as the water is essentially returned to that water body in an appropriate clean condition. In the Western United States, there is a legal framework called prior appropriations of water, where water is actually owned. And the ownership of water is governed by who owns it first. And for people who are interested, the Western United States right now is grappling with a long-running drought. And the issue of water law is very current because large cities like Los Angeles, California, and Phoenix, Arizona demand so much water that they may have to start taking water away from farmers who farm in those states. And the legal system of prior appropriations is being challenged right now as they try to figure out how to allocate limited supplies of water to people and farms and other uses. But in the eastern portion of the United States, where New York City is, it's similar to Ukraine, where nobody owns the water. It can be used and theoretically returned to the water body after use. But that's because the eastern United States, especially the northeastern United States, it's just a very wet area. We have ample amounts of rain.
Дякую за відповідь.
Пане Петро, я не знаю,
Thank
чи
you.
ви отримали відповідь на своє
Petro,
запитання.
have you got an answer to your question? Would you like to clarify? All in all, yes, that's clear. Thank you.
Дякую.
Great.
Можливо, є в когось запитання?
Okay, maybe you have more questions. Otherwise, I will still ask Tom to maybe add a bit more information about your organization, how you function.
Okay, so yes, my organization, we essentially were created by local farmers and citizens who were pushing back against New York City's regulations because they perceive these regulations as destroying their communities, their livelihoods, their businesses, essentially their history. So they formed a group of people and fought New York City in court, fought New York City to a standstill. They prevented New York City from obtaining permits from our federal government for their water supply system. And this forced New York City into negotiations with the watershed communities. And the outcome of that negotiation was the creation of my organization, as well as another organization called the Catskill Watershed Corporation. And we have different missions and we work with different people, but we came from that local citizen-led effort. And we really represent those people. That's where our foundation is. We represent them in this relationship with the city. So we continue to advocate on their behalf when it comes to New York City's management of the New York City watershed. My organization, we have 3 primary programs. We have the forestry program, which I am the manager of. We have an agricultural program that is much larger. The forestry program, I have 8 staff total. Our agricultural program has 30 staff plus contracting staff that work with us. So our total organizational size is about 100 to 110 individual professionals. In addition to our forestry and agricultural programs, we also have an easement program that specializes in the purchasing of development rights within the New York City watershed. And we have a much smaller economic viability program that is focused on working with farm and forest businesses in the New York City watershed to enhance their business viability and their economics, to help them stay in business and to become more profitable. And specifically within the forestry program, I just spoke about our work with loggers, but we also have a robust education and training effort that we do. We have a very extensive logger training initiative where we hold workshops to train loggers in the safe use of chainsaw. We also provide training in the efficient removal of trees from the woods to increase their profitability. And we also provide various workshops to just inform them about things that could help their businesses. One of our workshops brings police officers who enforce laws about trucks together with loggers who own log trucks so that they can talk about how to solve problems and adhere to the law. So we do that for loggers. We have a very robust landowner education element to what we do, where we're trying to arm landowners and teach them with information that will help them keep their forest land as forest and continue to own it over time. Another part of what we do is focused on teaching school children and teachers from New York City, as well as the upstate watershed, about the role forests play in water quality. This is very important, especially in New York City, because it's not uncommon for children in New York City to have never experienced a forest or have never even seen a reservoir. So what we'll do is we provide them funding, and they will get a bus and they will drive the 200 kilometers up to the New York City watershed, and they will view a reservoir, they will see the forest, and they will understand how these things are providing the water that comes out of their taps when they get a drink. We also train their teachers. We provide them with curriculum that teaches, so they can teach their students about this connection between the watershed. Part of that curriculum actually involves teaching the New York City residents about the sacrifices made by the communities in the upstate watershed and how they were displaced and how their cemeteries removed, so that these New York City residents can appreciate the sacrifices that local people in the watershed are making for their water. So we have a very strong educational part of what we do as well. And I think and we also have a research and demonstration element where we work with universities to conduct research in the watershed, which we seek to publish for the benefit of the science. And we have some forestry-focused economic viability initiatives that really get into detail with loggers about their businesses to analyze their profitability on a harvest by harvest basis, so that they can make better choices when they are negotiating contracts to cut timber for sawmills. And I think that's a quick explanation.
Дякую, Том.
Thank you, Tom. And that's a very diverse mandate and organization. And I see this question: what are the sources of funding for your organization?
So we receive 99% of our funding from New York City itself and from New York City water rate payers. We function under long-term 5-year contracts to do this work. So we enter into a contract agreement with New York City to perform this work. New York City is required to perform this work by law. So New York City has agreements with New York State, as well as the United States federal government, that requires this work to be done. We do receive a small amount of funding from the U.S. Forest Service. This funding specifically pays for the education that we provide to school children and teachers in the watershed in New York City. That's what the bulk of the money is used for. The Forest Service money also pays for our logger training efforts as well. So although it is a small in the portion of our overall organizational budget, it is a very important part of it.
Тобто у вас багато джерел фінансування.
So you have multiple funding sources from water consumers, from the loggers with whom you cooperate. You also provide educational services to them. You're also paid by state structures and ministries via some comprehensive approach. So you have a comprehensive approach to funding. Okay, we have a few more questions that are related to activity of your organization and members of organization or partners of organizations? What is the form of property of loggers that your organization cooperates with? How much timber do you log per year, and can individuals do the logging within the New York watershed?
Sure. So the loggers that we work with, they're just private citizens. Anybody who has a chainsaw can cut a tree down on private land, if, with permission of the landowner, and sell that tree for profit. So I don't have a volume of timber estimate for you because it's very difficult to track that number. We only know how many hectares of forest land are harvested through spatial analysis and the use of computer software and aerial photography. Loggers and sawmills are often hesitant to share that specific information with government entities, and they are not required to do so as far as the amount of volume of trees that they harvest.
Дякую за відповідь.
Thank you for the answer. We had a comment from Yuri. I think everyone is interested in this role of individuals in the preservation of natural resources. The Environmental Protection Fund is doing that in Ukraine to stimulate nature protection activities. Unfortunately, the money from this fund is hardly ever used for water evacuation pipes, prevention of hill erosion, or other nature protection measures in the forest. Our loggers would also be perhaps more motivated to preserve the environment if that were possible. This is the comment from Mr. Yuri Verbalyan. And perhaps anybody else has any questions. There's one more question on chat, apparently. Okay, the question from Oksana. Do other states have organizations like yours that are introducing best practices and promoting best practices?
Yes, so it's unusual for there to be a private non-governmental agency doing this work. That is unique in the United States. Typically, this work is done by state agencies in each state, and federal law requires that each state have an agency that is at least attempting to do this work as far as the voluntary best management practices and encouraging their use. The use of financial incentives is also very unique to New York City. It is much less common across the United States to have a program similar to ours and at the intensity of ours, where we're providing intensive financial incentives to encourage this work. So we are fairly unique. And part of the reason we're unique is because New York City is such a large, affluent city. They can afford to do this, to fund these programs. So there are many, many smaller cities and villages in the United States that cannot afford these sort of programs. And I've spoken with many of them over the years. I don't think what we do has to be done exactly this way. There are pieces of what we do that can be useful to smaller cities and municipalities that have less resources, like our loaning skidder bridges out to loggers. It's a very low cost, but highly effective way to protect water quality.
Дякуємо, Том. Ще одне запитання в нас було.
Thank you, Tom. We had one more question that I reviewed. Is there any planning on the afforestation, tree and forest planting? Is there some kind of centralized, I guess, planning or coordinated afforestation planning?
That's a really interesting question. And, the short answer is no. There's not a large focus on afforestation because we are already very highly forested landscape and our forests naturally regenerate. After harvesting is done, there is no need to replant. The forest just grows back. It's fairly unique. Now, there are some programs that we have that focus on planting trees next to streams to enhance riparian buffers. But those are very limited because our landscape is already 80% forested.
Thank you. Great. So you have natural rejuvenation, and the matter of afforestation is not an issue, basically.
It's not an issue yet. The development of forest land into housing and structures can threaten our overall amount of forest land that we have, but unfortunately there's no way to reforest those areas because they're being converted to another use. So yeah, 100 years ago, 20% of our landscape was forested because 80% of the landscape was being farmed. It was pasture land for dairy cows. But over time, that land is naturally regenerated into forest land because the economics of dairy farming changed and farms went out of business and the land was left to be reclaimed by nature.
Дякую.
Thank you.
Скажіть, будь ласка, колеги, чи в когось...
Colleagues, does anyone have any more questions at this point, or shall we wrap up gradually?
Ага, тут є ще одне запитання.
Okay, there's another question there.
Мабуть, тому що переважають вибіркові рубки лісу.
Because selective loggings predominate.
Уточнюючи питання стосовно лісозаліснення.
Clarifying question about afforestation. Probably you do not have the plan of afforestation because the logging is a planned activity.
The logging, there is no landscape level plan for logging because each landowner makes their own decision regarding the harvesting of trees on their property. And there are 35,000 forest landowners in the watershed.
Дякую.
Thank you for the answer. Does anybody else have any questions, or shall we look at the test questions and then we will wrap up the day?
Tom, may I ask you to stop sharing the screen? Thank you. Так. І у нас тут. Є тут такі запитання, які ми підготували до кожного.
We have prepared some questions that, we will prepare questions for every webinar. There will be a different number of them, but the point is that the participants would be able to check to themselves, to test how they understood the situation and the information, because we have certain limitations. For instance, we speak different languages, and there may be also some misunderstandings. So this is more of a test questions, but if anybody would like to answer them, you're very welcome. If not, we can review this again, and Tom can briefly answer these questions again.
For asking people to answer, and if not, you quickly repeat the answer to these 5 questions. Чому впровадження найкращих управлінських практик здійснюється
Why the implementation of best management practices is conducted voluntarily in the New York watershed? There was a lot of discussion on that. And I very much hope that Tom's answers have made it clear for everyone that they are the organization that should motivate and stimulate service providers, loggers, and land users to apply those best practices voluntarily. And there are financial incentives tools which helps that.
Друге питання, як заготівля,
Second question, how does logging and logging equipment influence the water quality? I'll be happy to hear the voice of any of the participants.
Якщо ні, можемо спитати відповіді ще раз у Тома.
Otherwise, we can ask Tom to answer the question again.
Sure. So logging equipment, the heavy weight of logging equipment compresses the soil, which reduces its ability to absorb water. The water then becomes runoff on the surface of a trail, a road, and it begins to erode the surface of the road itself. And this erosion, this sediment, can then be transported with the water into a stream and into New York City's water supply.
Дякую, Томе. Назвіть
Thanks, Tom. Can you provide 2 best management practices to filter the sediment before the surfacial flow gets into the water flow?
Okay, Tom, then it's your turn.
Then, Tom,
Sure.
it's your turn.
Sure. So we could use silt fencing or straw bales to intercept the water with the sediment in it, the runoff, before it makes it to a stream. And the silt fence and the straw bale can filter out the sediment, and then clean water can enter a stream, or cleaner water can enter a stream.
Спасибі. Наступне питання. Чим вирівнювання поверхні,
Next question, how can leveling the surface and removal of ruts help preserve water quality?
Дивно, що нас Володимир Леонідович
It's odd that Volodymyr is not getting involved in this process. Tom, the floor is yours, we guess.
Sure. So the tracks that wheels make in a road can act to channel water, and it can take a small amount of water and actually put it in a small area, and that can then cause more erosion than necessary. So smoothing out the ruts can spread the water out to reduce its power for causing erosion.
Дякую за відповідь.
Thank you. And the last question, name 2 best management practices that allow for a removal for the surface drainage from waters and from the ruts.
And you, again.
Sure. So a water bar is a very simple structure that removes water from the surface of a road before it can erode the road itself. An open top culvert is another structure that can do that. And we're just trying to manage that water flow in small amounts and return it to its approximate place in the natural landscape before it can collect in volume that will do damage to our roads and trails.
Угу. Я уточню, тому що переклад був перешкоди для води, про які сьогодні розповідав Том. І були
I will clarify about the obstacles. There were illustrations of those obstacles, and this is one of the best management practices of what Tom mentioned.
Добре. Ми наблизились до завершення.
Okay, we're now approaching the end. Does anybody have any more questions for Tom or for anyone of the organizers? Is Yuri clapping his hands or is he asking a questions? Because I had issues with Volodymyr. Thank you. No, this is applause actually. No, I understand that practitioners in afforestation and forestry are thinking about this, and tools like hay bales or pipes with outlets are simple, but it's simple. Our foresters would hardly carry sort of hay bales around the forest now, and they have very low motivation. They have a lot of pressure from the government. There are all kinds of commissions. Instead of motivating and stimulating, we take more of repressive measures and radical measures. And the people who are taking care for the state budget in the time of war, that's so you have to understand the current reaction of foresters who are not sharing their experience too actively. But I understand that they could also provide a lot of examples as to how to best protect nature. And they don't just provide examples, they actually do a lot. And Mr. Hromyak, who is present here, is also doing a lot of good thing in the Lviv region. But sharing or not sharing, that's their thing, and it's up to them. And I'm grateful that they've got involved in the seminar. Thank you very much, Yuri, for this comment. Would anyone like to say their impressions of this comment, of this webinar? We have fewer participants now, but still quite a few. So I think each and every one of you who have stayed through to the end, maybe you'd like to say something. The microphone is free. Turn on your mic and speak. While you're thinking, I would like to make another 2 announcements. I've been asked about certificates, whether there will be any certificates based on these trainings. Yes, we've discussed this with the organizers. We will present certificates and indicate the topics of the webinars at which you were present. Also, since not everyone can be present in this specific time, that is why we are recording these webinars. Therefore, we shall send the recording to all the participants. Everybody who's willing to get these topics is welcome to get the recordings, because not everyone is interested in every topic. And if you're interested, you can send us the answers to the quiz questions at the end, and we will record your participation in this specific topic. And the second question related to the activity of our Forza NGO, but not this particular training, but it's relevant for the work of each and every one of you. We have launched a questionnaire on how the representatives of forestry in Ukraine are getting their knowledge about, like, their professional knowledge pursuant to their work. And if I may, I will send this to your emails, because I have your email from your registration. If you don't wish, don't fill it out, but you know, it doesn't take too much time to fill out this questionnaire. You're welcome to participate in this poll. It will give the understanding about how forestry education is established in Ukraine. These are my announcements at the end of the webinar. If anyone would like to present their impressions, you're very welcome. Turn on your microphone, your cameras, and speak. While everyone is silent, I would like to say I'm a new person here. I was most interested in this watershed management and general water issues, because water is more and more of a problem in our community. Water availability, potable water availability, and we thought it was just the team of our organization, that it's because, you know, the sediment introduction because of all the illegal loggings. But now we understood that forest management has a lot of significance there. So there's a lot of management efforts to be made. Thank you very much for this information. Thank you. Mr. Yuri Gromyak has turned on his camera. Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank the US colleagues for such a brilliant presentation, and I'd like to make a proposal. Based on these opinions, based on this webinar, if you could introduce some proposals, perhaps in terms of legislation, on the financial incentives to cities, so that the cities could somehow think about stimulating the loggers. For us, at this point, this sounds like science fiction, but I believe the proposal needs to be made. We have the experience of the country that we're looking up at, and I think it would be very appropriate. this is the proposal from the foresters. Wonderful proposal, Yuri. We spoke about this on numerous occasions. This is called ecosystem fees. And if we want forestry management to influence the water quality, we have to have some compensatory mechanisms. Thank you very much for raising that. Does anybody want to say anything, or shall we thank each other? Okay, let's wish a good day to the colleagues from the US, and let's wish a good evening to the colleagues from Ukraine. Thanks everyone again. I'm grateful for everyone's participation, and I wish you all the best. Thank you to have calm and safe days. Let's thank our armed forces of Ukraine for the possibility to study and to work. And thanks everyone. Thanks and goodbye.
If possible, we propose that we stay the organization.